Before 1961, getting a pair of glasses in America meant two separate trips. First, you made an appointment with an eye doctor. You waited, sometimes weeks. He handed you a prescription on a slip of paper, and then you were on your own. You took that slip to a separate store, an optician, waited again, paid again, and finally walked out with glasses that may or may not have felt right. Nobody questioned it. That was just how it worked. Then a man named Dr. Stanley Pearle opened a small office in Savannah, Georgia, with 5 employees and one idea that sounds almost embarrassingly simple today. What if you could do it all in one place? By the 1980s, that idea had grown into the largest eyewear chain in America. Hundreds of neighborhood locations from coast to coast. A jingle so familiar that an entire generation could sing it without thinking. Millions of Americans who saw clearly for the first time because of a doctor they trusted, in a store that felt like a part of their community. Then it was sold, and sold again, and sold again, until the name on the sign belonged to an Italian conglomerate that also owned the frames, the lenses, and the insurance that paid for all of it. How does a brand built on a doctor's promise end up as a line item in one of the most powerful corporate monopolies the world has ever seen? That is the story of Pearle Vision, and it is more than the story of a company. It is the story of what happens when trust becomes an asset, and assets get sold to the highest bidder. Stanley Pearle was not born into the eyewear business. He was born into a generation that believed in building something with your own hands and keeping it. He served in the United States Navy during World War II, the way so many men of his era did, without fanfare and without complaint. When the war ended, he came home and chose a profession rooted in something quiet and meaningful, helping people see. He trained as an optometrist, passed his boards in Texas, a state that announced results the next day, which suited an impatient young man perfectly, and went to work as a junior partner at Lee Optical in Corpus Christi. He stayed at Lee for 10 years. 10 years learning how the business worked, watching how patients were treated, understanding what the industry got right and what it got stubbornly, unnecessarily wrong. And what it got wrong was this: the system was built for the convenience of the profession, not for the people it served. A patient who needed glasses had to navigate 2 separate worlds. The eye doctor lived in one world, clinical, appointment only, operating on the doctor's schedule. The optician lived in another, retail, transactional, no medical authority. Between those 2 worlds was a gap that cost patients time, money, and in some cases, accuracy. Nobody was connecting the 2. Nobody saw a reason to. Stanley Pearle saw a reason. In 1958, after a decade of learning someone else's business, he decided to build his own. He was still living in Texas when he made the decision, but he looked east, to Savannah, Georgia, a city he believed held more opportunity than anyone else had noticed. In 1961, he opened the first Pearle Optical in a small office with 5 employees, a modest selection of frames, and an examination room where he himself sat across from patients and looked into their eyes. The concept was so simple it is almost hard to believe no one had done it before. Walk in, get your eyes examined by a licensed optometrist. Choose your frames from the selection on display. Come back in a few days, sometimes less, and pick up your finished glasses. 1 visit to schedule the exam. 1 location to handle everything else. No separate appointments. No separate bills from 2 different professionals. No slip of paper handed to a stranger in another part of town. For the first time in American retail history, a person could walk into a single storefront and leave days later, seeing the world clearly. What the store felt like in those early years matters. It was not a medical office, cold and fluorescent and intimidating. It was not a department store counter staffed by salespeople in suits. It was something in between, warm enough to feel approachable, professional enough to feel trustworthy. The frames were displayed behind clean glass cases. The examination room was just behind the retail floor, close enough to feel connected, separate enough to feel private. It smelled of the particular combination of plastic and metal and glass cleaning solution that anyone who wore glasses in that era will remember immediately. And there was Stanley himself, not a distant founder managing from a back office, but a working optometrist, sitting down with patients, adjusting frames by hand, asking the question that would eventually become the backbone of an entire brand. Does that look right to you? Does that feel right? He was not selling glasses. He was taking care of people. The patients who came through that first door in Savannah were ordinary working Americans. Families from the surrounding neighborhoods, people who had put off dealing with their vision because the old system was too complicated, too expensive, too fragmented. Savannah in the early 1960s was a mid-sized southern city, its downtown still anchored by small businesses and local institutions, its residents accustomed to knowing the name of the person who served them. Stanley Pearle fit that world perfectly. He was a neighbor who happened to be a doctor. His philosophy, in his own words, was straightforward. I'm eager for it to be a good company with a reputation for service and quality because that's what I'm all about. Not market share, not expansion, not investor returns, service, quality, reputation. Those three words would define Pearle Vision at its best, and their slow disappearance over the decades that followed would define everything that went wrong. By the late 1960s, Stanley Pearle was no longer just a doctor with one store. He was acquiring small optical chains and absorbing them into his model. In 1971, he purchased a 17-store chain owned by Robert Hillman and Larry Cohan. Both men stayed on after the sale, joining Pearle in building the network outward. The one-store idea from Savannah was becoming something larger, still recognizable, still rooted in the original philosophy, but now with reach. The question was whether that philosophy could survive the reach. For a while, for a long, golden while, it could. There is a specific memory that millions of Americans who grew up in the 1970s carry with them, even if they have never thought to name it. It is a Saturday morning. A parent is in the driver's seat. The car pulls into a shopping center. Not a mall, not yet, but one of those open-air strips of stores that anchored every American suburb in that era. There is a dry cleaner, a pharmacy, a shoe repair shop, and on the corner, with its clean signage and bright interior visible through the plate glass window, is a Pearle Vision Center. The child inside does not want to be there. Eye exams are not exciting, but the parent says it is time, and so they go in, and the door opens, and there is that smell. Plastic and metal and something faintly antiseptic, and the rows of frames behind the display cases, and a receptionist who smiles and says they will be right with you. And then the doctor comes out. He knows the parent's name. He asks about the last visit. He is unhurried. He sits across from the child and flips lenses one at a time, asking that ancient, reliable question. Better or worse? One or two? And a few days later, the child comes back. The frames are ready. The doctor adjusts them at the nose, at the ears, tilts them just slightly, steps back. Try those on. Tell me how they feel. The child looks up, and the world is sharp. The ceiling tiles have edges. The words on the wall poster are readable. Everything that had been soft and uncertain is suddenly, precisely real. That is what Pearle Vision was, at its best. Not a transaction, a moment of clarity, in every sense of the word. Through the 1970s, Pearle Vision expanded steadily across the United States, opening hundreds of locations in the suburban shopping centers that were defining post-war American life. The growth was not reckless. It followed the population, out of the cities into the neighborhoods where young families were buying houses, planting lawns, and looking for the kind of local institutions they could trust with the things that mattered. Vision care mattered. In a country where the baby boom had produced tens of millions of children now reaching school age, children who needed their eyes checked, who were squinting at chalkboards, who were struggling with reading, the demand for accessible, affordable optical care was enormous. Pearle Vision was positioned perfectly to meet it, and what separated Pearle from every competitor was not price, not location, not advertising. It was the model itself. Every Pearle Vision had a licensed optometrist on site, a real doctor, not a sales consultant, not a technician running an automated machine. The exam was real. The prescription was real. The follow-up was real. When you came back the next year, the same doctor remembered you, or the records were there, Or the staff knew your family because your family had been coming for years. That continuity was not a small thing. For American families in the 1970s and 1980s, finding a doctor you trusted, any doctor in any specialty, and then being able to return to that same face year after year was one of the foundational comforts of a stable life. Pearle Vision offered that comfort, dressed in the convenience of retail. The franchise model launched in 1981 extended this without breaking it. The people who bought Pearle Vision franchises were not, in most cases, corporate investors looking for a return. They were optometrists, working doctors who saw in the Pearle system a way to run their own practice with the support of a national brand behind them. They hung the sign above the door, they stocked the frames from the approved catalog, they ran the television ads that came from corporate. But the doctor in the examination room was still their doctor, and the patients were still their patients. That same year, 1981, Stanley Pearle established the Pearle Vision Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing eye care to people who could not afford it. It was not a marketing gesture. It was an extension of the same instinct that had opened the first store in Savannah 20 years earlier. The belief that seeing clearly was not a luxury and that a business built around vision had a responsibility to the people who needed it most. And then there was the jingle. Nobody cares for eyes more than Pearle. 7 words, sung softly, warmly, without drama. It aired on television through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, and it did something that most advertising only pretends to do. It told the truth. Because in the neighborhoods where Pearle Vision had taken root, in the shopping centers where families had been coming for years, the statement was accurate. The doctor did care. The staff did care. The whole model had been built around the idea that caring was the product. If you are in your late 50s or 60s today, there is a reasonable chance you can still hear that jingle without being prompted. It lives in the part of memory where the reliable things are stored, the smell of your grandmother's kitchen, the sound of the screen door in summer, the feeling of your first pair of glasses being placed on your face by someone who took the time to get it exactly right. By the mid-1980s, Pearle Vision was the largest optical retail chain in the United States. Hundreds of locations, a brand name recognized from coast to coast, a franchise network of doctors who had built their careers inside its walls. Millions of patients who had never gone anywhere else and had no intention of starting. What could go wrong? The answer, as it always is, was already there. In the paperwork being signed in an office far removed from any examination room, by people who had never once asked a patient whether the lenses were better or worse. In 1985, Stanley Pearle made a decision that was entirely rational and entirely consequential. He sold. The buyer was Grand Metropolitan, a British conglomerate whose portfolio included Pillsbury, Burger King, and a collection of consumer brands assembled with the cold logic of a company that saw value not in what a business did, but in what a business was worth. Grand Metropolitan paid a significant sum for Pearle Vision, and Stanley Pearle, now in his mid-60s, stepped back from the company he had built from a single room in Savannah. He remained on the periphery, his name still on the door, his legacy still referenced in the marketing, but the decisions were no longer his. The examination room still had doctors. The jingle still played on television. From the outside, nothing had changed, but something fundamental had shifted. Pearle Vision was no longer a doctor's company. It was an asset in a portfolio. And assets in portfolios are managed differently than businesses built by hand. Grand Metropolitan's strategy was simple: scale. Under their ownership, Pearle Vision expanded aggressively, pushing past the regional clusters where the brand had grown organically and planting locations in markets that had never heard the jingle, never visited a store, never experienced what made the original model work. By the late 1980s, Pearle Vision had grown to more than 1,000 locations worldwide. The number looked extraordinary on a quarterly report. What it obscured was harder to measure. The gradual loosening of the standards, the slow drift away from the doctor-first culture that had made every one of those locations worth visiting in the first place. Profits, Grand Metropolitan discovered, were elusive at that scale. Running a national optical chain with a doctor on site at every location is expensive. The margins that look comfortable at 100 stores became complicated at 500, and genuinely difficult at 1,000. The corporate response was predictable. Find efficiencies, reduce costs, standardize operations. The problem was that the thing being standardized, the relationship between a doctor and a patient, does not respond well to efficiency measures. In 1996, Grand Metropolitan sold Pearle Vision to Cole National Corporation for $165 million. Cole National was headquartered in Twinsburg, Ohio, and its history reads like a tour through mid-century American retail. The company had started in 1944 cutting keys. It had moved into shoe repair, watch bands, children's toys, cookie baking franchises, personalized gift stores. It was a company that understood retail as a system, a set of levers to pull, a set of formats to operate, and it had been building its optical division quietly and aggressively throughout the early 1990s. The Pearle acquisition was Cole National's largest and most ambitious move. It added 692 locations to Cole's existing optical network of roughly 1,500 stores, gave the company a 21% stake in Pearle Europe, and pushed Cole National's total optical footprint to the edge of market leadership. 1 year later, in 1997, Cole acquired American Vision Centers, which operated the New Vision Optical and Eyes First Vision Center franchises, and crossed the line. Cole National was now the largest optical retailer in the United States. On paper, it was a triumph. In practice, it was the beginning of a different kind of problem. Cole National was not an eye care company. It was a specialty retail company that happened to be an eye care. A distinction that sounds minor, but ran through everything they did. The metrics that mattered to Cole National were retail metrics: revenue per square foot, same-store sales growth, average transaction value. These are legitimate measures for a company selling keys or personalized gifts. They are an imperfect fit for a company whose product is a medical examination performed by a licensed professional. The franchise owners felt the difference immediately. Men and women who had built their careers as optometrists, who had come to Pearle Vision specifically because it allowed them to practice real medicine inside a viable business model, began to notice that the conversations coming from corporate were increasingly about selling and decreasingly about seeing. The pressure was not always explicit. It did not need to be. It showed up in the metrics they were evaluated against, in the product mix they were encouraged to push, in the tone of the communications from headquarters that framed eye care as a retail category competing for consumer attention. Some franchise owners adapted, some pushed back. Some quietly began to wonder whether the name above their door still meant what it had when they signed their franchise agreements. The patients, for their part, did not notice yet. The examination room was still there. The doctor was still there. The frames were still behind the glass cases, and the jingles still played, and the experience still delivered what it promised. Most of the time, in most locations. The erosion was real but invisible, the way erosion always is until the ground gives way. What none of them knew, not the franchise owners, not the patients, not even most of Cole National's own executives, was that a far larger force was already moving toward them. It had been building for years in Milan, Italy, assembling pieces of the eyewear industry, one acquisition at a time, with a patience and a precision that would eventually make Cole National look like a minor chapter in a much longer story. That force had a name, and in January 2004, it made its move. Before everything changed, there was a moment when Pearle Vision was simply everywhere. Not everywhere in the way that chains are everywhere today, algorithmically placed, interchangeable, indistinguishable from the next location in the next city. Everywhere in the way that mattered in the 1980s, present in the neighborhoods where people actually lived, embedded in the routines that structured American family life, recognized not just as a store, but as a place, your place, the place your mother took you and her mother took her, and that you would one day take your own children because it had never once let your family down. At its peak in the mid-1980s, Pearle Vision was the largest optical retail chain in the United States. More than 1,000 locations stretched across the country, from strip malls in suburban Ohio to shopping centers in coastal California, from small cities in the South where Stanley Pearle had first hung his shingle to the sprawling northern suburbs, where the baby boom had deposited its tens of millions of young families. The brand had achieved something that most retail companies only dream of. It had become a verb. People did not say they were going to get their eyes checked. They said they were going to Pearle. The television commercials of that era are worth remembering not for their production value, they were modest by any standard, but for their tone, a soft voiceover, a family, a child trying on frames for the first time, and underneath it all, the jingle, "Nobody cares for eyes more than Pearle." It did not shout. It did not promise the lowest price or the fastest turnaround. It made a quieter claim that this was a place where the people behind the counter actually gave a damn about the people walking through the door. In an era before cynicism became the default register of American advertising, that claim landed. People believed it because, in most locations, it was true. The generational transmission of Pearle Vision was not a marketing strategy. It was something that happened naturally, the way trust passes between people who share a good experience and want others to have it too. A grandmother who had been going to the same Pearle Vision location since the early 1970s brought her daughter. The daughter brought her son when he started squinting at the television. The son, years later, brought his own children. Not because of an advertisement, not because of a loyalty program, but because Pearle was where the family went. It was as settled a fact as the church they attended or the hardware store where the father bought his tools. These were the institutions that gave a neighborhood its texture, and Pearle Vision had earned its place among them. For the franchise owners who ran these locations, that loyalty was the most valuable thing they possessed. It was not transferable. It could not be replicated by a corporate directive or conjured by a national ad campaign. It had been built one appointment at a time, one patient at a time, over years and sometimes decades of showing up and doing the work with care. A franchise owner in a mid-sized Midwestern city might have patients whose families had been coming to that specific location for 15 or 20 years. Patients who asked for the doctor by name, who trusted his judgment on frames because he knew their face, who would not dream of going anywhere else. What did it feel like to work there, at the height of it? Ask anyone who staffed a Pearle Vision in the early 1980s and the answers carry a consistent warmth. The pace was human. The work had meaning. An optician who spent 30 minutes helping an elderly woman find frames that fit her face properly knew with certainty that the work mattered, that the woman would go home and be able to read again, or recognize faces across the room, or see the expression on her grandchild's face with clarity she had been missing for years. There is a particular satisfaction in work that produces that kind of result, and the people who did it well understood it without needing it explained. The brand was also, quietly, one of the more inclusive institutions in American retail. In an era when healthcare access was uneven and specialist visits were prohibitively expensive for many working families, Pearle Vision offered a legitimate medical service at a price point that working-class Americans could actually reach. The one-stop model eliminated not just the inconvenience of 2 appointments, but the additional cost: 2 copays, 2 travel trips, 2 scheduling headaches. For a family living paycheck to paycheck, that compression of cost and time was not a convenience. It was the difference between getting the kid's eyes checked and putting it off for another year. Stanley Pearle had understood this from the beginning. His foundation, launched in 1981, extended the same logic outward, bringing free eye exams and glasses to people who could not afford the store at all. The brand and the mission were the same thing, expressed at different price points. What did it feel like to receive a pair of glasses at Pearle Vision for the first time? When you were a child who had been struggling to see, when the frames went on and the world sharpened and you looked at your parent across the room and realized you could see the individual strands of their hair? That moment belonged to Pearle Vision. Hundreds of thousands of those moments accumulated across a generation in neighborhoods from Maine to California were what the brand actually was. Not the logo, not the jingle, not the quarterly location count, the moments. What happens to all of those moments when the company that holds the name stops being the company that earned them? The answer began arriving in the spring of 2004, in the form of a press release from a company most of Pearle Vision's customers had never heard of, announcing a transaction most of them would not understand. with consequences none of them could yet see. The cracks did not appear all at once. They never do. They appeared the way water finds its way through old concrete, slowly, quietly, in places that most people were not looking. A franchise owner in Cincinnati who noticed that the new corporate guidelines left less room for clinical judgment. A longtime patient in suburban Atlanta who came in for her annual exam and found for the first time that the doctor she had seen for 11 years had been replaced by someone she had never met. A staff optician in a Colorado location who was pulled aside by his manager and told that the frames on the middle shelf, the ones with the highest markup, needed to move faster. None of these moments made the news. None of them would have registered as significant to anyone outside the specific location where they occurred, but they were happening across the network, in different cities, in different states, with different details but the same underlying cause. The company that owned Pearle Vision was making decisions that prioritized the ledger over the examination room. The first structural crack had actually appeared before Cole National during the Grand Metropolitan years. When a British conglomerate absorbs an American healthcare-adjacent retail brand and attempts to scale it past 1,000 locations, certain things become inevitable. Quality control loosens, hiring standards drift. The culture that made the original locations trustworthy, a culture transmitted person to person, doctor to staff to patient, gets diluted by the sheer volume of new locations that have no living connection to what the brand was at its beginning. By the time Cole National took ownership in 1996, they inherited a network that was already showing signs of inconsistency. Some locations were still running exactly as Stanley Pearle would have recognized: doctor-centered, patient-first, community-embedded. Others had drifted toward a retail experience that happened to include an eye exam, rather than a medical experience that happened to be conveniently located. Cole National, to their credit, understood the problem. Their solution, however, was a retail solution applied to a medical problem. They invested in store design. They standardized the customer journey. They created training programs and operational guidelines designed to produce a consistent experience across thousands of locations. These are entirely reasonable tools for a company selling personalized gifts or cutting keys. They are imprecise instruments for managing the relationship between a doctor and a patient. The franchise owners who had built their businesses on that relationship began to feel the friction. The conversations from corporate shifted in register. Where previous ownership had spoken the language of eye care, patient outcomes, clinical standards, community trust, the new language was retail. Conversion rates, average ticket size, attach rate on premium lenses. These terms were not inherently wrong. A business has to sustain itself. But when they become the primary vocabulary through which franchise owners are evaluated and managed, something changes in the examination room. Subtly, gradually, but irreversibly. A doctor who knows his performance is being measured by how many patients upgrade to anti-reflective coating is still a doctor. He still performs the exam with care. He still gets the prescription right, but there is a new pressure in the room that was not there before, and patients, who are often more perceptive than businesses give them credit for, can feel it. The appointment that used to feel unhurried begins to feel occasionally like it is moving toward a conclusion that was decided before the patient sat down. At the same time, the competitive landscape was shifting in ways that Cole National was not fully equipped to address. Lens crafters had surpassed Pearle Vision in total locations by 1992, and their positioning, faster, more polished, oriented toward a slightly more upscale customer, was drawing the kind of aspirational consumer that had previously been Pearle's. The glasses in about an hour promise was a genuine differentiator, and it resonated in an era when convenience was becoming the dominant value in American retail. Pearle's response was to compete on trust and clinical quality, which was the right instinct, rooted in the brand's genuine strengths. But trust is slow to build and difficult to advertise, and in the mid-1990s, the marketing budgets and the brand consistency required to communicate that trust were not always there. And then, quietly at first and then with gathering speed, the internet arrived. The first online eyewear retailers were modest operations, easy to dismiss. The selection was limited. The experience was clunky. A person still needed a valid prescription, which meant they still needed to visit a doctor. But the model pointed towards something that would eventually become a serious disruption, the possibility of separating the medical exam from the retail purchase entirely. If a patient could get their prescription from their doctor and their frames from a website, the integrated model that Pearle Vision had pioneered in 1961, and that had been its core competitive advantage for 3 decades, was no longer the only option. Cole National had no meaningful digital strategy. Neither did most of their competitors, to be fair. This was the late 1990s, and the optical industry was not alone in underestimating what was coming. But for a brand whose identity was built on the value of the one-stop, in-person, doctor-patient experience, the rise of an alternative that disaggregated that experience was a particular kind of threat. How long could a brand built on a doctor's personal promise hold its ground when the systems surrounding it had stopped speaking the language of medicine? The answer arrived not from a competitor, not from the internet, not from a shift in consumer taste. It arrived from Milan, Italy, in the form of a company that had spent 40 years building something that made Cole National look, in retrospect, like a warm-up act. On January 27, 2004, the Wall Street Journal ran a story that most of Pearle Vision's customers never read. The headline was precise and bloodless, the way financial journalism tends to be. Italy's Luxottica agrees to pay $441 million for Cole National. To anyone outside the eyewear industry, it registered as the kind of corporate transaction that happens every day. One company buying another, numbers exchanged, press releases issued, stock prices adjusted. To anyone inside the industry, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the board was cleared. Luxottica was not a household name in America. That was, in a sense, precisely the point. Leonardo Del Vecchio had founded Luxottica in 1961 in Agordo, a small town in the Italian Alps, manufacturing components for the optical industry. The founding year is worth noting, 1961, the same year Stanley Pearle opened his first store in Savannah, Georgia. Two men, in two very different places, with two very different visions of what the eyewear business could become. Pearle built from the patient outward, starting with the examination room and working toward the retail floor. Del Vecchio built from the factory outward, starting with the manufacturing and working toward everything else. By 2004, Del Vecchio's outward expansion had not stopped. It had accelerated systematically for 4 decades. Luxottica manufactured frames for Ray-Ban, which it had purchased in 1999 for $640 million. It manufactured frames for Oakley, which it would acquire in 2007 for $2.1 billion after a period of deliberate market pressure that left Oakley with little choice. It held exclusive licensing agreements to produce frames under the names of Chanel, Prada, Burberry, Versace, Polo Ralph Lauren, Tiffany, Donna Karan, and Vogue. It owned Sunglass Hut, the dominant sunglass retailer in airports and shopping malls across the world. It owned Lens Crafters, the largest optical retail chain in the United States, which it had acquired in 1995. And now it was buying Cole National, which meant it was buying Pearle Vision. The transaction closed on October 4, 2004, after the Federal Trade Commission reviewed it and cleared it, unconditionally, without requiring Luxottica to divest a single asset. This was the decision that several industry analysts and consumer advocates would later identify as the moment the American eyewear market stopped functioning as a competitive marketplace. In a single transaction, the owner of Lens Crafters became the owner of Pearle Vision, the two largest optical retail chains in the United States, brands that had spent a decade competing for the same customers, the same locations, the same franchise owners, were now subsidiaries of the same Italian conglomerate. USA Today ran a piece at the time titled, "Antitrust Worries Rise Over Lens Crafters' Pearle Merger." The worries did not stop the deal. To understand what this meant for Pearle Vision specifically, it is necessary to understand what Luxottica had built and what it was still building. Luxottica did not simply own retail chains. It owned the supply chain that fed those chains. The frames on the shelves at Lens Crafters and Pearle Vision were, in large proportion, manufactured by Luxottica in its Italian and Chinese factories. The designer brand's customers believed they were choosing freely the Ray-Bans, the Oakleys, The Prada frames, the coach frames, were Luxottica products manufactured under license and sold through Luxottica's own stores at prices Luxottica set. But the vertical integration went further still. Luxottica also owned Eyewear, one of the largest vision insurance providers in the United States. This meant that Luxottica was not only making the frames and selling them in its stores, it was also administering the insurance plans that determined which frames patients could afford. The circle was, functionally, complete. A consumer enrolled in an Eyewear Vision plan would walk into a LensCrafters or a Pearle Vision, choose from a selection dominated by Luxottica manufactured frames, pay with benefits administered by Luxottica's insurance arm, and leave believing they had navigated a free market. In 2012, CBS News brought this structure to a mass audience. 60 Minutes aired a segment called Sticker Shock: Why Are Glasses So Expensive? And for the first time, millions of ordinary Americans understood what had been built around them. The segment walked viewers through the ownership structure with the careful patience of someone explaining a magic trick after the reveal. The brands you think are competing are owned by the same company. The insurance that tells you what you can afford is owned by the same company. The store where you cash in your benefits is owned by the same company. The reaction from viewers was, by the standards of a business news segment, remarkable. People were not confused. They were angry, not in a political way, in a personal way. The feeling of having been managed, of having moved through a system designed to look like a marketplace while functioning as something else entirely, was visceral. These were people who had trusted Pearle Vision for decades, who had believed, because they had been told, and because it had once been true, that nobody cared for eyes more than Pearle. The revelation that the company carrying that promise was now a subsidiary of a foreign conglomerate controlling the frames, the lenses, the stores, and the insurance. It did not land as a business story. It landed as a betrayal. For the franchise owners, the experience of the Luxottica years was more immediate and more specific. Many of the optometrists who had built their practices under the Pearle Vision name had done so precisely because the brand allowed them to be doctors first. The franchise agreement gave them access to a national brand, a marketing infrastructure, and a supply network, but it had always left the clinical relationship between doctor and patient intact. The examination room was theirs. The prescription was theirs. The relationship was theirs. Under Luxottica, that autonomy began to narrow. The pressure was not always explicit, and it is important to be precise about what is documented versus what is alleged. What is documented is the structural reality. Franchise owners in a Luxottica-owned network were operating inside an ecosystem where the parent company controlled not only the brand above their door, but the frames on their shelves, the insurance plans their patients carried, and the competitive environment in which they operated. An independent optometrist who wanted to offer frames from a manufacturer outside the Luxottica portfolio faced a system that made that difficult in ways that were structural rather than contractual. Pricing advantages, supply relationships, insurance network preferences, all of which tilted toward Luxottica products. The franchise owners who had spent 20 or 30 years building their patient base under the Pearle name found themselves in a position that Stanley Pearle himself would not have recognized. They were still doctors. They were still caring for their patients. But the business surrounding that care had become something foreign, a mechanism for distributing the products of a vertically integrated empire, with the Pearle Vision name serving less as a statement of values and more as a familiar face on an unfamiliar body. And who was supposed to protect them? Who was supposed to stand between the doctors who had built their lives inside this brand and the corporate logic that was systematically remaking it from the outside in? Stanley Pearle himself died on July 21st, 2011 at his home in Dallas, Texas. He was 92 years old. The obituary noted that he had founded Pearle Optical in 1961, that he had built the first coast-to-coast optical retail chain in American history, that the jingle he had made famous was still recognized by millions of Americans. It was a dignified farewell to a man who had genuinely changed the way Americans accessed eye care. By the time he died, his company had been sold 4 times. His name was owned by Luxottica. His jingle was still in use. a warm, familiar voice attached to a structure he had not built and would not have chosen. The examination room was still there. The doctor was still there. But the world around them had been remade quietly and completely by forces that had nothing to do with whether a patient could read the bottom line of the chart. The collapse of Pearle Vision did not announce itself with a bankruptcy filing or a single catastrophic event. There was no morning when the lights went off simultaneously in every location, no press conference where an executive stood at a podium and told the country that it was over. The collapse was quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling, because the name stayed on the signs while everything the name had once meant was slowly, methodically removed from beneath it. To understand what was lost, it helps to look at the numbers not as financial data, but as a map of disappearance. At its peak under Cole National in the late 1990s, the Pearle Vision network, corporate stores and franchises combined, operated across more than 2,000 locations in the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. It was a national presence of genuine scale, woven into the retail geography of virtually every metropolitan area in the country. By the time Luxottica completed its restructuring in the years following the 2004 acquisition, that number had fallen dramatically. By 2018, when Luxottica filed its year-end figures, Pearle Vision operated 110 corporate stores and 419 franchises across North America, from over 2,000 locations to just over 500, a reduction of more than 75%. Each location that closed was not an abstraction, it was a specific address in a specific community where a specific doctor had spent years learning the names of the families who came through the door. The Luxottica years brought a restructuring philosophy that was coherent from a corporate standpoint and devastating from a brand standpoint. LensCrafters was Luxottica's premium American retail asset. Higher price points, more contemporary store design, positioned for the aspirational consumer. Pearle Vision, within the Luxottica portfolio, occupied a different tier. It was the neighborhood brand, the franchise-heavy operation, the one with the older customer base and the deeper community roots. In a rational corporate portfolio, you do not invest equally in all tiers. You invest in the asset with the highest return potential, and you manage the others for cash flow. That is what happened to Pearle Vision. The corporate-owned stores were the first to feel it. Locations that required renovation did not always receive it. Locations in markets where LensCrafters was also present, which given the breadth of the Luxottica retail network was a great many markets, faced the particular indignity of competing against their own corporate sibling for the same patients, with fewer resources and less investment. The staff in these locations knew what was happening. The patients arriving for their annual exams began to sense it too. In the condition of the carpets, in the age of the frame inventory, in the way the appointment felt slightly more rushed than it used to. The franchise locations were more durable because they were insulated by the commitment of the individual doctors who owned them. An optometrist who has spent 20 years building a patient base does not allow the store to deteriorate simply because the parent company has reduced its investment. He fixes what needs fixing himself. He stays late. He absorbs the costs that corporate no longer covers because the alternative, losing the patients his family depends on, is unacceptable. But even those franchise owners were operating against a current that was moving against them. The 60 Minutes broadcast in 2012 was a turning point, though not the kind that produces immediate change. What it did was name something that patients had been feeling for years without having the vocabulary to express it. The vague discomfort of walking into a Pearle Vision and sensing that the experience was no longer what it had been. The frames seemed to come from the same small circle of manufacturers. The prices seemed higher than the selection justified. The insurance benefits seemed to root towards specific products in ways that felt less like coverage and more like direction. All of that discomfort now had a structure attached to it. Luxottica, vertical integration, a company that manufactured the product, sold the product, and insured the product, operating through brands that Americans trusted precisely because they believed those brands were independent. The consumer response was not a boycott. Americans, by and large, still needed glasses. The Pearle Vision near their home was still often the most convenient option, particularly for patients whose insurance was administered by EyeWare, which directed them toward Luxottica retail partners. The system was too complete to exit easily, but trust, once named and examined, is difficult to restore. The patients who had grown up believing that nobody cared for eyes more than Pearle were now aware, many of them for the first time, that Pearle was not a person, not a doctor, not even an American company. It was a trademark, one of several, in a portfolio managed from Milan. The final chapter of the corporate store era came in 2018, when Luxottica completed its merger with Essilor, the French company that was the world's largest manufacturer of ophthalmic lenses, to form Essilor Luxottica. The combined entity controlled both the frames and the lenses. The manufacturer of Ray-Ban now also manufactured the Varilux progressive lens inside your Ray-Ban frame. The circle that had been nearly complete since 2004 was now fully closed. For Pearle Vision, the merger accelerated the exit from corporate operations. The remaining 110 corporate stores were systematically converted to franchises or closed. The brand would continue. Pearle Vision was too recognizable, too deeply embedded in the memory of too many Americans to simply dissolve. But it would continue as a franchise system, a licensing arrangement, a name that independent operators could buy access to, operated entirely by the franchise owners who remained. What that meant in practice was this: the Pearle Vision that exists today is not a company, it is an agreement. A franchise owner pays for the right to use the name, the marketing materials, the operational systems. What they bring to the arrangement, the clinical skill, the patient relationships, the years of community presence, is entirely their own. The brand provides the sign above the door. Everything that made the sign worth hanging was built by the doctors underneath it. The last corporate-owned Pearle Vision stores closed without ceremony. There were no final day crowds, no local news cameras, no moments of public mourning of the kind that accompany the closing of a beloved restaurant or a downtown department store. The stores simply stopped being corporate and became something else: franchise, competitor, empty retail space. And the people who had worked in them moved on or adapted or, in some cases, bought the franchise themselves and kept going under the same name, now truly on their own. One optometrist, speaking to a trade publication in the years following the restructuring, put it in terms that require no translation. The brand name still carried weight with older patients, he said. They came in because they remembered Pearle Vision from 30 years ago, because the jingle was still somewhere in their heads, because the name felt trustworthy. What they found when they arrived depended entirely on who was behind the counter. The name made the promise. The doctor had to keep it. That is both a tribute to the franchise owners who remained and an indictment of what corporate ownership had made of the original vision. Stanley Pearle had built a system in which the name and the promise were the same thing, where the brand was the guarantee because the brand was built by doctors who meant it. What survived the ownership cascade was the name without the guarantee and the guarantee without the name, separated, like so many things in the story of Pearle Vision, by decisions made far from any examination room. After the corporate stores closed and the franchise network contracted, the question that remained was not about Pearle Vision specifically. It was about something larger, something that the Pearle Vision story had made visible in the way that a single, well-lit example can illuminate a pattern that had been operating in the dark for years. The pattern was this: an American business built on a personal promise, grown into a national institution, sold to a succession of owners who valued the asset without understanding the culture, and finally absorbed into a monopoly so complete that the original promise became, functionally, unenforceable. Pearle Vision was not the only company this had happened to, but it was one of the clearest cases, because what had been lost was not merely market share or revenue or store count. What had been lost was a specific kind of trust built between specific people that no acquisition price had ever accounted for and no restructuring plan had ever known how to preserve. The competitive landscape that filled the space Pearle Vision had vacated told its own story. Warby Parker launched in 2010 with a founding premise that would have been entirely familiar to Stanley Pearle. The existing system was unnecessarily complicated, unnecessarily expensive, and unnecessarily hostile to the person it was supposed to serve. The company offered prescription glasses starting at $95, a price point made possible in part by bypassing the vertically integrated distribution system that Luxottica had spent decades constructing. They sold online first, then opened physical locations that combined retail and clinical care under one roof, staffed by licensed optometrists designed to feel approachable rather than institutional. The irony was not subtle. The disruption that Warby Parker brought to the eyewear industry in 2010 was, in its essential structure, the same disruption that Pearle Vision had brought in 1961. One stop, real doctors, reasonable prices, a system designed around the patient rather than around the margins. The fact that a startup needed to reinvent this model 50 years after Stanley Pearle had already invented it was a precise measure of how completely the intervening decades of corporate ownership had dismantled what he built. Warby Parker's success, it went public in 2021 at a valuation of roughly $6 billion, was a verdict on the system it had disrupted. Consumers had not stopped wanting what Pearle Vision had once offered. They had simply stopped being able to find it reliably inside the Luxottica network, and so they found it somewhere else. For the franchise owners who remained inside the Pearle Vision system, the aftermath was a more complicated negotiation. The ones who had built deep community roots, the optometrists whose patients had been coming for 15 or 20 years, whose waiting rooms had seen 3 generations of the same family, whose staff had been with them long enough to remember patients by name before pulling up the file. These franchise owners were largely insulated from the worst of what corporate contraction meant. Their value was not in the corporate support structure. Their value was in the room, and the room was still theirs. But the brand they operated under had lost much of its power to attract new patients. The jingle was gone from television. The national advertising budget had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been at the brand's peak. A 30-year-old looking for an eye doctor in 2015 did not have the same instinctive reach for the Pearle Vision name that their parents had in 1985. The brand's equity, the accumulated trust of decades of consistent doctor-first service, had not been actively destroyed. It had simply been allowed to age without maintenance, like a building whose owner has decided that repairs are an expense rather than an investment. The franchise owners who thrived did so by becoming, in effect, what Stanley Pearle had always been: independent doctors who used the brand as a starting point and built everything that mattered from the patient relationship outward. The name above the door got them in the conversation. What they did inside the examination room determined whether the patient came back. The broader lesson that the Pearle Vision story offers the American retail landscape is both simple and consistently ignored. There is a category of business, not large, but important, whose value is inseparable from the trust relationships that created it. These are businesses built by practitioners, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, financial advisors, the original founders of franchises who understood their customers as people rather than as transactions. When these businesses are acquired by entities whose primary competency is capital allocation rather than the underlying practice, the trust relationship does not transfer with the deed. It stays with the practitioner. And when the practitioner eventually leaves, through retirement, through frustration, through the simple passage of time, the trust leaves with them, and what remains is the infrastructure of a relationship that no longer exists. Cole National understood retail. Luxottica understood manufacturing and distribution and vertical integration. What neither of them understood, what the ownership structure made it structurally impossible for them to understand, was the specific weight of a patient sitting down across from a doctor they had chosen, in a place they had been coming to for years, trusting that the person on the other side of the examination table had their interest, and only their interest, at heart. What do we lose when that kind of place disappears? Not just from the building on the corner, but from the culture that once produced it and expected it and relied on it? When the gathering place is gone, and nothing takes its place that was built on the same terms, what fills the space where the trust used to be? The answer, in the case of American eye care, is a system that functions, that produces glasses and fills prescriptions and processes insurance claims with reasonable efficiency. But it is a system, not a promise. Not a doctor who knows your name. Not the particular reassurance of sitting in a chair across from someone who learned their profession because they wanted to help people see, and who opened their own practice because they believed that how you help people matters as much as whether you help them at all. Stanley Pearle understood that. He built it into every square foot of a small office in Savannah, Georgia in 1961. And for a generation of Americans, it was simply there. Reliable, familiar, taken for granted the way all good things are until they are gone. There is a particular light that existed inside a Pearle Vision Center in the 1970s and 1980s that is difficult to describe to someone who was not there. It was not the harsh fluorescent glare of a hospital corridor, not the warm amber of a restaurant, not the aggressive brightness of a department store designed to make everything look its best. It was something in between, steady and clean and honest, the kind of light that does not flatter and does not intimidate, the kind of light in which a person can simply be seen clearly. The frames were arranged behind glass in careful rows. The carpet was neutral. The receptionist smiled the way people smile when they have been doing a job they are good at for long enough that the warmth is genuine rather than performed. And in the back, behind a door that was always slightly ajar, was the examination room. The chair reclined. The room went dim. The chart appeared on the wall, black letters on white, and the doctor leaned forward and slid a lens into place and asked the question. That quiet, unhurried, endlessly repeated question that was also, in its way, a kind of care. Better or worse? One or two? For millions of Americans who grew up in that era, the memory of that room is the memory of the first time the world made sense visually. The first time the leaves on the trees were individual and distinct. The first time they could read the board at school without leaning forward and squinting and hoping. The first time they understood that what they had been experiencing as normal was not normal at all. That clarity was available and that it had been waiting for them in a room just like this one, in a strip mall just like this one, in a neighborhood just like theirs. That was what Pearle Vision gave to people. Not glasses, clarity, and the particular human warmth of receiving it from someone who had chosen, as a life's work, to provide it. What Pearle Vision meant at its best was something that resists the language of business. It was a neighborhood institution in an era when neighborhoods still had institutions, when the people who served you were the people who lived near you, who recognized your car in the parking lot, who asked about your children because they had met your children. It was a place where a working-class family could access genuine medical care without navigating the intimidating architecture of the healthcare system. It was a model that proved, for 3 decades, that doing right by the patient and running a viable business were not competing priorities, that the trust earned in the examination room was the most durable competitive advantage any company could possess. It was also, and this should not be forgotten, the life's work of hundreds of optometrists across the country who chose to build their practices under that name because they believed in what the name represented. These were not passive participants in a corporate story. They were doctors who showed up every morning, unlocked the door, turned on that particular light, and spent their days doing the work that Stanley Pearle had done in Savannah, asking the question, adjusting the frames, making sure that the person leaving was seeing the world more clearly than the person who had walked in. Their contribution to the Pearle Vision story is inseparable from the story itself. The brand that millions of Americans remember was not built by corporate executives or portfolio managers, or the succession of conglomerates that passed the name between them like a deed to a property they had never visited. It was built by those doctors, by the staff who stayed through multiple ownership changes because the patients needed them, by the patients themselves who returned year after year and brought their children and told their neighbors, because they had found something they trusted and were not willing to give it up lightly. What the ownership cascade destroyed was not the examination rooms or the frame selections or even the jingle, which survived longer than anyone might have expected. What it destroyed was the coherence, the sense that the name and the promise and the practice were all pointing in the same direction, toward the same thing for the same reason. When a brand loses that coherence, it does not die immediately. It persists under its own momentum for years. The patients who remember what it was continue to return. The franchise owners who built their careers inside it continue to show up. The sign continues to glow above the door. But the thing that made the sign worth something is gone. And the people who were there for it know the difference, even if they could not always say exactly when it changed. Somewhere tonight, an older patient is sitting in a waiting room. Not necessarily a Pearle Vision, perhaps just any optical practice that felt, when they walked in, something like what Pearle Vision used to feel. They are there for their annual exam, the one they have been getting every year for as long as they can remember. The ritual that began in childhood when a parent brought them in and a doctor leaned forward and changed the way they saw the world. They do not think about Luxottica. They do not think about Cole National or Grand Metropolitan or vertical integration or the Federal Trade Commission. They think about whether their prescription has changed and whether the frames they chose last time are still the right ones, and whether the doctor will take a moment, the way the good ones always do, to ask how they are doing beyond the chart on the wall. That moment, when it comes, belongs to no corporation. It cannot be acquired or restructured or folded into a North American retail group. It exists between two people in a room, in the specific and irreplaceable way that all the things worth preserving exist, not in the asset column of a balance sheet, but in the particular quality of attention that one human being pays to another. Stanley Pearle knew that in 1961, he built a company around it. For a long time, the company kept the faith. Nobody cares for eyes more than Pearle. It was always meant to be a promise. For a generation of Americans who were there when it was kept, it still is.